Hey guys, welcome to another session of the Futurist Series. Today we have Simon Dingle with us today. Very, very interesting gent. And as always, I'd rather Simon prefer to do an intro and let him describe who he is and what he's about. Simon.
Thanks, Shamalan. I'm all about fintech generally. I run a company called Lettuce, and I have some other interests in the fintech space, some companies that I'm invested in, and some products that I consult on. I wrote a book which came out a couple of years ago called In Math We Trust, which is about the future of money. Through some media work, so I used to have a radio show, still have a podcast, do some writing here and there. But pretty much all focused on fintech most of the time.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to jump the gun. You know, a lot of these chats are purely focused on who you are, how tech has influenced your decisions. I'm very curious. So I'm going to jump into it straight away and ask you, what were the main three things that you learned when writing In Math We Trust?
I'm not sure that there would be exactly three.
Right.
So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was doing it was the quote from Stephen King. In his fantastic book on writing, he says, to write is human, to edit divine. And I think, a lot of the process of producing a book is in the editing process.
Right.
And the actual writing of the book is just how the project starts. I don't think it's necessarily even the most important part of the process.
Yeah.
I think another thing that it made me realize again is that writing is the best way to consolidate your thoughts about something or percolate them.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been working in the cryptocurrency space since 2011, predominantly with Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't thinking about writing a book. And when my publisher approached me to do so, that took me on a journey where I actually had to sit down and take these thoughts out of my head that had been accumulating over the last, at that stage, I guess it was 6 or 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
put them down on paper, so to speak, and really think about these opinions I have, these ideas that I've formed, in a way that I hadn't had to do, just in speaking about it at conferences, etc. So I found that, extremely helpful, cathartic in a way. So we're on two things now, hey?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I realized is that, most of the writing I'd done before, I did a lot of columns for magazines and things, but most of my writing at that stage was online.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm used to being able to log in and change things when my mind changes or I spot a typo. And it was very weird going into exclusive books or, other bookstores and seeing my book on the shelf and I can't change, it's there now. This is it. This is my thinking on the matter. And if I change my mind about anything, tough, like the book's there,
Right.
So that was a very strange realization is I think with online content, or at least my approach to online content, it kind of goes out there, but it's almost a living thing you can hack at over time.
Yeah.
Whereas a book, you kind of have to let it go into the world, and then it's this piece of creative work that's out there, and you can't change it. So I suppose there's a lot of art that's similar to that, but it was a new experience for me.
Awesome. Look, I'm not an expert on cryptocurrency. Obviously, like with many people, I think people have a base understanding and many analogies in which they are able to understand and contextualize what it is and what the implications of it in the real world are. What was fascinating for me is that you mentioned 2011, but 6 or 7 years before that, you started thinking of that. And I think a lot of the thinking on people seeing value happened within the crash within 2008 to 2009. But obviously you've been trying to look a little bit forward and were able to think about things a couple of years before that, which I find really fascinating. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, I started working with cryptocurrency in 2011. So that was already past the crash. My book came out in 2018. So I wasn't that ahead of the curve. But I think that the 2009 crash was fascinating. And it really was the beginning of a process, at least from my perspective, where more and more people were thinking about how the world of money works.
Yeah. Yeah.
and and in a way that we hadn't before. I think there was a lot of the financial world that was just taken for granted by people, and the 2009 crash really got people waking up and thinking, like, what is a derivative? What are these words that I've heard but have no idea about, and now I've turned my world upside down. So
Hmm.
I think it was an interesting time for everyone.
I actually have another question that's kind of off topic. And uh,
Hmm.
what would you say is the difference between fintech and financial technology? Because I think,
Well, mhm.
yeah, yeah.
I was going to say, in my mind, they're the same thing. Fintech is a
Okay, interesting.
buzzword. It's
Yeah,
just, to me, it's, financial technology. It's a shortened way of saying the same thing, I think.
interesting. I think a lot of
except,
people.
except it's cool, right? Fintech is cool. Financial technology sounds boring, but they're both, using technology to improve the world of finance ultimately. So I think they're the same thing.
Yeah, interesting. And this is, I think, the what separates the buzzword from the actual substance behind it is the way that you said it, uh, the way that we use technology to improve the world of finance, as opposed
Mm,
to, I guess, the way a lot of other people would think of financial technology are, or would be the existing tools that we use to manage working within the world of finance. So fintech now is
awesome.
more of an emerging sort of forward-thinking, as opposed to
Yeah.
financial technology, which you would have any of the tools and process that you would use existing.
Yeah. I guess
Okay.
definitions are interesting things. It's like, what's the difference between or a data scientist and a statistician? The one maybe
Ooh.
has a Mac, but
Nice.
and it
Okay.
sounds cooler.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. So Simon, please, if you could tell us how, and if we could go back, if you could tell us
Hmm.
how tech has influenced your education or career choices, from
Hmm.
when you would say you were at that pivotal point of making those decisions.
It's an interesting question because I think tech's just always been there in my life. I suppose when I was a very small kid, there wasn't that much technology at home. Maybe just an old Philips television, one of those ones where like the whole house shook when you changed the channels.
Yeah.
But we got our first personal computer when I was 9 years old. So I think from pretty early on, computers were part of my everyday to some extent. And my poor father couldn't keep me away from this thing. Like I would just rip it apart and try and upgrade the RAM, hack the auto exec and config.sys files, break his computer that he relied on for work every other week.
Yeah.
But I was obsessed with this thing, and so it's hard to think of a world without tech. I can't really say how tech necessarily um, affected my way of working or thinking, because it's just always been part of it. And I think that's something I find curious about a lot of the discussion, especially with big corporates that are talking about digitalization and what their strategy is for technology. To me, that's like saying, what's your strategy for oxygen? It's like, it's there. If you don't
Hmm.
breathe it, you die. I don't think there are any companies today that can say they're not technology companies. I mean,
Hmm.
whether you're in agriculture or reforestation or fishing, or you're using digital technology somewhere, even if it's just to message somebody you work with. So to me, it's part of everything. And I think, like with any set of tools or methodologies or processes, it's about what you do with it. There are a
Hmm.
lot of bad ways to do technology, and there are a lot of good ways to do technology.
Hmm.
And I think the how is more important than the what when it comes to deploying any technology, really.
Interesting. And maybe as you progress in your teenage years, deciding to go to university and continue your studies, what was the decision making processes or factors that led you
Oh,
to where you are?
laziness mostly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I spent most of high school feeling like I was crazy and the rest of the world was normal, and not fitting in a lot.
Hmm.
Um, and I spent my university years. I didn't finish my degree, but flipping the switch on that and going, hold on, actually, I'm starting to feel now like everybody else is crazy and maybe I'm normal.
Hmm.
um, of course, neither answer is true. But there was never an obvious next step for me. It was never like, you have to finish school. Why? You have to go to university again. Why? And then what are
Right.
you going to study? I'm fucking 19. I don't know what I want to study. You know, like I haven't figured out anything. I don't even know
Yes.
what I feel like wearing.
Yeah.
Like, how am I supposed to decide what I want to study now?
Yeah.
And so I was in a very privileged position in that, you know, my parents were firstly able to send me to university, which is a massive privilege.
Mm-hmm.
But I could pursue things that really interested me. And at that stage, it was radio. I was obsessed with the medium. It was something that I had been thinking about since a young age. I used to have
Mm-hmm.
one of those old tape decks and record conversations with my brother. I don't even know why, but there was something amazing about that to me.
Right.
And so I studied at the University of Pretoria, and I worked at the campus radio station, Tux FM, which I didn't know at the time was the biggest campus radio station in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, we could have a whole
Tux.
discussion about campus radio,
That's
but
crazy.
because of the satellite campuses around Tshwane,
Yeah.
the University of Pretoria's radio station had a license to broadcast on FM at a much higher frequency than most other campus radio stations get, so that they could reach a wider area. Anyway, there are lots of factors that enter into it.
Yeah.
But I was very fortunate in that I think most of my learning at university happened at the campus radio station and not in, you know, my psychology and English and business management classes.
Mm-hmm.
I basically just studied whatever I had to stay at the university so that I could work at the radio station.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a little bit like there's that very cliched Steve Jobs saying that people throw around about how you can only connect the dots in reverse.
Mm-hmm.
I've never really found it useful to look at what other people have studied or what their career path has been necessarily. I think there are nuggets you can take from it, but you know, ultimately this is something that is unique for everybody. And I always felt like asking somebody else what they did, you know, is like, if they're successful, is like asking for last week's lotto numbers. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you know,
Right.
he won and he played these numbers, but that doesn't mean I'm going to play the same numbers and win. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of how I think about it now. But back then I just knew I wanted to be on radio.
Okay, that's very interesting. So coming into that, and we fast forward a couple of years, that move from where you are or where you were in radio to Lettuce, maybe if you're going to take us through that journey.
Well, I mean, I was always obsessed with technology, you know, so from that first personal computer that my father brought home, and just being obsessed with, you know, video games predominantly, but also how it worked, and you know, computer networking in particular. I think as soon as I learned that this was a thing, I became obsessed with network science. I didn't even know it was called that, but the way that information was flowing in this new digital world. And of course, you know, that took on a whole new dimension when we got our first internet connection when I was a teenager. But that became the obsession. And so I did a lot of things. I worked in radio. I used to compile CDs that went on the cover of a magazine when I worked at SL.
Okay.
I was a music editor. But I always had this passion and this fascination with technology, and I would always get pulled back towards that world. So, you know, I was working at a lifestyle magazine. I was writing predominantly about art, movies, music, a little bit about video games, but mostly those other things. But I was working on a Linux machine at my desk, and the same publisher that published the lifestyle magazine also published some technology magazines, including the South African franchise for PC Format.
Okay.
And the editor was like, you know, what are you doing with this Linux machine? And I started talking her through some of the crazy things we were doing with Linux back then to hack games, to work on it using a system called YNX, which was later Dingle. And she was like, whoa, you need to write something for PC Format. And so, you know, 2 months later, I wrote a cover story for PC Format on Linux gaming. And I just kept getting pulled back into the technology world. And in a roundabout way, I went through working with the Shuttleworth Foundation, exploring my passion for open source projects, open content movements. I did some work with iCommons. I think, you know, eventually that led me to this intersection of technology and finance and money, which I kind of, again, wandered into. There was no plan. And went, hey, this is actually really interesting, because if you look at the flow of information online, that takes on a whole new dimension when you bring, you know, money and finance into it. And then the Bitcoin white paper, and us having money for the internet for the first time, and having a much better way of running a global economy in a decentralized way. one that actually acknowledges the internet instead of tries to fight against it like the traditional financial world. And so I ended up doing what I do today, which is building fintech products that answer questions that nobody else in my world has answered for me yet. But again, there wasn't a plan. I just sort of ended up here and couldn't be happier.
That's really fascinating, and I think that magnetism, you were open to it. A lot of people, a lot of businesses, as you mentioned now, either try to regulate it, try to ignore it, go as far as they can without digitally transforming themselves. What would you say in your experience, and you also mentioned something earlier, where every single business is a technology business, whether they realize it or not,
Yeah.
What would you say are some of the learnings that you would offer to certain businesses at this moment in terms of embracing the future?
Sure. I mean, there's so many ways to think about that, and I also don't believe that there are these fundamental truths that everybody has to adhere to, outside of the laws of physics, obviously. But I've seen so many different approaches that have worked. At my company, we've got a lot of, I wouldn't call them constraints necessarily. We've got a lot of ways of working that we've developed that work very well for us. I prefer working with small teams. I don't like working with big teams. I subscribe to Brooks' Law, which is that the later a software project gets, the more engineers you add to it, the later it gets. So basically, the more engineers are working on a piece of software, the longer it takes to deliver once it's late already.
Interesting, right?
Is it in a, so there are a lot of counterintuitive things that work for us, and I wouldn't call them things that everybody has to think about. But maybe what's useful is I wrote an article a few years ago called "Dinosaurs Can't Climb Trees," and it was an observation I made after serving on the digital transformation board of a massive multinational, and just looking at how this company, not only were they failing to innovate, they fundamentally couldn't do it because the business was disincentivized to do it. So they wanted to do it. There was an intention from the top that digital's cool, we're going to do it. They could never tell me exactly what they wanted to achieve with it, just that they wanted to do it because their competitor had an app, so why don't they have an app? That kind of thinking. But really, I realized that they couldn't do it. It wasn't a case of how do you do it? It's like you can't. You're too big, you're disincentivized, and you fundamentally need to change the way the business thinks about this thing and about processes and about its customers before you can get anywhere. Because the companies that are dominating, just about any vertical in the world today, and the big technology companies that get it right better than most, arguably, your Apples, your Googles, those are not technology companies. They're fundamentally design companies, right? And every discussion they have doesn't start with the technology. It starts with a customer, a persona, a need. And then they work back towards how technology gets used to solve that, because the technology is there, right? It's like oxygen. When you need it, it's going to be there. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to deploy it? What need are you trying to solve? How does that impact the bottom line? So I think, weirdly in 2020, I still meet people at a lot of big corporates where it's just the shiny thing they want.
Right.
It's like, okay, but what do you want it for? What are you doing with it? And they can't really answer that. And design thinking, which I think is, something that more and more people are understanding, and something that, certainly in the startup world we take for granted, gets paid lip service in the walls of the big corporates, but they just time and time again show that they don't know how to do it because they fundamentally do not care about their customers, right? What they care about is the success of a product that was developed 30 years ago that somehow is still around today, and perpetuating a status quo that's been built around that product. And they think innovation is, having a new website or developing an app that gives you access to that same old project or product. And to me, that's not innovation. You haven't changed anything fundamentally. If you look up the definition of innovation, it's fundamentally about removing steps from processes. It's about efficiency. It's about making something fundamentally better, not just putting lipstick on the pig, which is what most corporate innovation is. It's like, hey, we got a cool app. Look how nice our app is. It's like, yeah, that is cool. but it's not innovation. You haven't changed anything. It's the same product, same customers,
Right.
same shitty experience, just with a nice app. It's so I don't know that that's useful in any way. that's my opinion on it. But I guess to take something from it that's actionable is think about incentives, because if you've got an intention to digitalize, to transform, to innovate, but your senior executives are still incentivized to maintain the status quo, you may as well just go home. You're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from if we look at it from a top-down perspective, a healthy dose of problem-solving thinking, design thinking, and trying to, once again, it's a buzzword, but trying to center everything around your customer is definitely something that's definitely a valuable comment. I think so. I wouldn't say that it's definitely it's not of value or intangible in a way. If we take a step back and look at the tangible things that companies are battling with, I definitely think it's skill sets at the moment, access to the right skill sets, and because in South Africa specifically has such a low employment rate, the transformation of existing skill sets without mass retrenchment and then rehiring, it's a difficult journey to make, so excluding the top down sort of strategical thinking, I mean, from an operational perspective, any sort of insights into how companies could better their processes?
I'm so hyper focused on the startup world and so out of touch with sort of big companies. I literally, I'm polarized against working with big corporates, and every time I've tried, it's like, it's lasted a few months at best. I can't do it. So
Exactly.
I'm not sure that I have anything useful to share.
Okay.
with big corporates, but
if we take it back to startups, and I 100% am with you behind, I believe that the lifeblood and the future of the health of our economy depends on innovation and small to medium enterprise, as opposed to bureaucratic corporates, right? So just in terms of that, any sort of insights?
Yeah. I mean, we've spent a lot of energy at Letters working with junior devs that have come out of programs that take people from backgrounds generally where they have the propensity for engineering, but they wouldn't be able to do it without a little help. And we've mentored some of those junior developers through our company. And that's been an incredible process. The best way to learn is to teach. And so firstly, having senior developers, when they're in a mentorship role, you really see the quality of their work improving in an amazing way as well. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about teaching is it's the best way to learn. So that's been great. The other thing I've really enjoyed about working with junior devs is that they are not tainted. They're not heavily opinionated. And something I find with a lot of senior developers or software engineers especially is they have very rigid, very strong opinions that aren't always loosely held.
Yeah.
And so the other thing I found refreshing with the junior developers that we work with is that they're very open to new ideas and new thinking, and they want to learn, and then they're not married to ideas. So that's great. And so I guess I would encourage organizations to think about working with, because I think a lot of startups have this obsession with finding the best person, or they'll put ridiculous kind of criteria in place for people they're hiring. Like, you have to have 5 years of experience, and you have to have this, and you have to have a degree. And it's like, in my experience, and I've hired so many people, varying degrees of success, but almost never has their years of experience and their qualifications meant anything about what they're going to do for my company.
Yeah.
And I think hiring is one of those things that a lot of companies overthink. So for me, I go and have coffee with somebody, right? I might have read their CV, but ultimately I don't really care what it says. And it's amazing in a 15-minute discussion with somebody, just like human beings, like, normal humans, like we've been doing this for 100,000 years. You get a very quick impression of their culture, which is the most important contribution they're going to make to your company. B, whether or not they're extrinsically or intrinsically motivated, which is, in my team, is the only thing I really care about. I can only work with intrinsically motivated people.
Right.
And once I know that, like, I don't care what else they know. Like, they'll learn anything they need to, you know.
Interesting.
If you're a software developer, you should probably know how to get your environment up and running. And it'll help a lot if you've used Node and GraphQL and other pieces of technology that are in our stack.
Yeah.
But if you haven't, I'm sure you can learn that too, you know.
Yeah. I tell you, and I'm nodding my head so vigorously, because even within HyperionDev, I started our placements team, so our career services and placements team, and going out there into the working world, communicating that this is the value of a junior developer that are coming out of our campus. Literally, it's the same mantra that you were speaking of now. Junior developers are untainted. There's a higher return on investment. Senior developers are being able to learn by teaching. You can always teach somebody new technologies if they have those fundamental basics, right?
Yes.
So it's really great that you're able to affirm this. Maybe if I had to play devil's advocate then, and sorry, I just want to make one more point with regards to hiring. More often than not, you'll find that there's so many, I don't want to use the word gatekeepers, but there's so many decision makers within the hiring process that aren't technical, right? So you'll have to get to the hiring manager, the recruitment officer, then often maybe even the hiring manager or the product manager who is unable to assess via a CV the technical quality of that candidate, right? So it's already starting off from the back foot. But that being said, let's use the recruitment process that you have at the moment. What advice would you give? This is twofold. What advice would you give, number one, for companies, whatever size, to try and remove bias in the interview process? And I think that's more leaning towards how you would approach it. And then number two, create an efficient way to assess a candidate's skill sets. Do you have any insights on that?
Absolutely. So I'll say this. There is nothing you can do in an interview to assess how well somebody is going to work with you. Nothing. The only way you're going to find that out is by working with them. So what we do at my company is, before we hire somebody, we work with them for generally 2 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer, on a project. So we go, okay, I like you. If you can, and sometimes people can't because they've got a full-time job, but usually they can, and otherwise we do it in their spare time. Jump into our sprint, jump into the next sprint, right? Or if you're a designer, let's talk about a design sprint. I'm going to give you work to do in the next 2 weeks. You're going to work with me and I'll pay you for it. And after that, we're both going to decide whether or not we want to work together, right? Okay. So sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's 3 weeks. We go through a sprint together. We do a piece of work together. I have a first-hand knowledge now of what this person is like to work with, their communication style, whether or not they're intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. We can do code reviews. We can interrogate and see how they've put together their thinking. And after that period, I generally have a very good idea of whether or not this is somebody I want to work with. And they have a very good idea whether or not they want to work with us. Because I think that's the other thing that happens quite often is, you're interviewing somebody who's going to work for the company, but they should be interviewing you too.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you don't want them finding out in month 6 or 7 that actually this is not a company they want to work with. The culture doesn't vibe with them or whatever. So I find that process valuable. It's something, again, that's counterintuitive, because intuitively you think, well, who can afford 2 weeks to see whether or not they want to work with a company? But every time we've had to do it, it's been fine. It's either been somebody who's in their month of notice period and the old company doesn't really care what they're doing, or they've been freelancing, or in the extreme cases, we go, fine, do it after hours, weekends, whenever. But I'm not hiring you until we've done some work together, even if it's just a workshop,
That's very valid.
So that to me has been incredibly useful. All of the psychometric testing, all of the interview processes that HR companies will tell you about, it's all been complete and utter bullshit in my world. Again, maybe it works for some people. None of that has given me any meaningful information about a person. And I've also, I've seen friends of mine hiring who go through these processes. They do the psychometric testing, the skills testing. This poor person's been through like 6 interviews before they get the job.
Yeah.
And then you find out, like, you know, them and the person they're sitting next to really hate each other. And a month later, one of them is leaving.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
had absolutely nothing to do with anything you were interviewing for.
Yes.
Because culture is not something you control. It's something you curate, right? You
Yeah.
could do things to affect the culture, but you are not in control of your company's culture. It has a life of its own.
Yeah.
And it comes from the people you hire, and you know nothing about them from a psychometric test when it comes to what they're going to do to the culture. Because in isolation, that's not something you can gauge about a human being. Culture is what happens when you put them together. And so another useful thing that I found is getting them to engage with the rest of the team as quickly as possible. Again, in that 2-week process where we're working together, that's the perfect place to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But even just inviting them, you know, for drinks with the company on a Friday afternoon, you know, this is something that's increasingly difficult now that we're all
Right.
at home on Zoom. But we actually do drinks over Google Meet as well at our company.
Okay.
But just getting them to socialize and interact with the other people and seeing whether or not that's something that works. Because ultimately, that's actually the most important thing you're looking for, right?
Yeah.
Can they communicate? Not only do they have the skills to communicate, but can they communicate with this team?
Mm-hmm.
Can they fit into this culture? You know, can they work with these people? So we try and find out that stuff, the things that matter, not the psychometric tests and the personality types, which is, you know, all astrology in my world.
Right. Okay. So, okay, since we're on the topic of the marketplace itself, and I think you've given some really great points in how companies can attract and source and identify to meet the demand, which is there. I think there's a very big discrepancy between the demand that's needed, whether companies realize it or not, and the
Yeah.
supply of individuals who can do the job. Any insights into how individuals who are looking to go into a career in tech, what are the parts that they might take to be able to meet that demand that's there?
It's interesting thinking about that demand to begin with, because when I speak to my friends who are hiring at corporates, they're like, they're not enough engineers.
Mm-hmm.
And when I speak to my friends who are working at startups, they're like, there are too many engineers. We've got too many to choose from.
Wow.
And so I think there are a few things where we're very lucky. One of them is that we have a very global view on this. So our front-end engineer, for example, is South African, but he lives in Canada. We're cool with that. So we'll work with anybody, anywhere. When it comes to the junior developers, we have a bias towards hiring in South Africa.
Okay.
But every time we've had a position open up, we've had too many people apply. It's not like we've had to really go and beg people to work with us or go on an extensive search for skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that speaks increasingly to our generation of people that want to work on things that matter, that want to work with teams that they vibe with culturally, that have criteria that go above and beyond just earning a salary. And that's something which, if you're a software engineer, you're extremely lucky, because you almost singularly have the ability to choose any employer you want anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So corporates struggle to attract these people because they're not doing anything interesting. They have horrible cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to work with them. Startups generally are working on exciting real world problems, actually get shit done, work on things that matter, have awesome cultures. Their workday aligns with reality.
Mm-hmm.
There tends to be less egos around because everybody's been punched in the gut a million times.
Oof, yeah.
And so I think if you're a young software engineer, you know, it's obvious where you're going to want to spend your time.
And also, it's so funny that the guys in corporate who can't find developers are so stringent on, we will only interview you if you have a comp sci degree at a minimum, right? So
Yeah, which is
what's your
weird
thoughts?
because not even Google requires that anymore.
Exactly, right. And in terms of your thoughts, self-taught versus tertiary education.
Self-taught every single time. You come to me and you tell me you are so obsessed with this thing that you spent your weekends and the time while your friends were watching Netflix learning how to do it, and that's why you know it.
Yeah, yeah.
Fuck yeah.
Okay.
Welcome, brother. I don't, your parents paid for you to get a comp sci degree at Stanford. Well fucking done. I don't know if you even care about what you're doing,
Right, right.
All I know is that you're privileged. So
Okay.
I'm not saying that you don't have the chops. Maybe you do. I will
Fair.
take self-taught every time. And it doesn't even matter what skill we're talking about. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, agreed,
Whether it's
agreed.
computer science or sport or playing a musical instrument, the real passion is in the people who taught themselves, especially when that was their only option because they couldn't afford to study. They are got massive respect.
And I think your story also speaks to that, because there was that enthusiasm and curiosity that kind of drew you to where you are now, even though it's not fundamentally what you position yourself to do, in terms of what you said you studied, I feel.
Yeah, possibly. I think it's also just my experience.
Yeah.
I want to work with the hackers. I want to work with the hustlers. I want to work with the people who are intrinsically motivated. And what screams intrinsic motivation more than somebody who's taught themselves a skill? Nobody's told them to do it. Their parents didn't tell them you're going to study this, otherwise, you're out on your own or whatever. They were not forced to do this. They chose this. I mean,
Yeah.
surely that's what you want. What more could you ask for?
I
Like
feel
that
you.
tells me everything I need to know about the human being. I'm not dissing education.
Right, right.
I think there's a lot wrong with the way universities are run today, but that's a different topic. So I'm not dissing the institutions. I'm not dissing that path, but
Yes.
I will take the self-taught hacker any day of the week.
Got you. Well, that's what we're about. So I'm completely aligned. Simon, I must say thank you so much for your time. It's been really engaging, and I think that
My pleasure, man.
there was a lot of ways in which we could have completely gone off topic and diverted in conversation many times. But I
Next
actually do
time.
have a question.
Yeah.
What's your prediction for the US election?
Oh God, I try not to talk about politics.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, we're actually today, obviously, people are going to watch us in the future, know what the answer to the question is. But while we're sitting here talking, the votes are rolling in the States and we still have no idea what's going to happen. And I'm just looking at, half of America, like, why is this a close race? Like, what is wrong with America that this is a close race? How could this possibly be a close race? Like it should be so obvious, but again, I try not to talk about politics.
I
If I
see,
can.
I see, I
I
see.
have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I have my personal view on what I hope happens.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, I just want to see democracy preserved, because I think what's worrying me is that you have candidates now in the USA threatening to subvert the
Right.
process,
Right.
to pull hijinks to win, and that's very worrying. I'm worried about the rise of extremism,
Mm-hmm.
and some very bad ideas that the world knows are bad ideas from recent history, really starting to become realities in the States. So I'm very worried, but I'm hoping that they do the right thing. But
Do
it's
the
just
right
so
thing.
disheartening to see that this is a close race. It's like, how can half of America be this stupid?
On a personal note, I guinea pigged myself, and I
Yeah.
started following a lot more right-wing media, right,
Oh
for the last
yes.
3 months at least.
Jeez, I'm sorry, man.
And I came across an article and I read it, and it made so much sense. I don't know if it was a psychology article, but the strong narrative that the right creates, it really it pulls you in, man. It really makes you question a lot of different things, and I think that could be one of the reasons why I feel like there's such a divide and
Yeah.
such a close race at the moment.
I'm scared of extremism in anything. I have a very rigid belief that if you have an extreme view, it's by default wrong. Whether it's extreme left or extreme right,
Yep.
if you're a fundamentalist about something, I'm sorry, but you're wrong, because the truth is always somewhere in between. And I'm yet to find an example where that isn't true, right?
Balance,
Um,
100%.
Yeah, especially when it comes to politics. So I'm not talking about whether or not you need to breathe, for example, but some things are binary.
Yeah.
But when it comes to human ideology, the edge is where things go to die. And you always end up in the same place. You go to the extreme left or the extreme right, and you end up with fascism. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I respect people like you that expose themselves to what's going on the opposite side of the fence and think about it. But you're right, a lot of bad ideas are compelling. They're designed to be compelling. The truth is always less interesting and more complicated.
More complicated.
It's more interesting once you get your head around it, but it's not obviously interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully curiosity is something that grows. Who do you think is going to win?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
It's
I know
fun
that
doing this on a video that people are going to watch a week from now and go, come on, guys, it was obvious.
To be fair, though, I did predict Trump 4 years ago, and I wasn't popular with my crowd. I honestly, I do think that he may just pull it. But I think Pennsylvania is one of the states that they're busy counting. I know that Biden is in the lead on the electoral side, so we don't know. We really don't know.
It just, again, I can't believe it's so close. Like literally, there's an old tin of mustard in my fridge that would do a better job of running the states than, and to see people go, well, I don't know because, Biden did this and this and this wrong. I'm like, at this stage, I don't really care. He could have burnt down an orphanage and I would still vote for him over Trump. It's like, how are you people thinking about this?
Right.
Like, you're talking about the guy who was sleeping with a porn star while his wife was giving birth, right? Who plays golf while 300,000 of his citizens die from a virus that he could have prevented, like, and the list goes on and on. Is the most pathological liar, the most self-absorbed, despicable human being. See, I'm getting into the politics.
We're getting there. We're getting there. It's getting heated.
But it's like, and you're going, oh, Joe Biden isn't perfect because, he was once a little bit inappropriate. And I don't give a crap what he did. It can't possibly be worse than anything Trump's done in the last 24 hours,
Right.
Like, I would literally vote for an old shoe before I voted for Trump. How is this a discussion? It blows my mind. But anyway.
Well, hopefully we get a chance to catch up after, and we can try and dissect exactly what's happening. But thank you so much, Simon, man. This was really fun. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to meet you and fun to chat.
All right. Cheers, gents. All the best.
Cool. Bye-bye.
Bye.